They told you the truth, but not the whole truth. What if everything you've been told about power, loyalty, and who's really in control was carefully trimmed just enough so you never asked the dangerous questions? The kind of questions that don't just challenge opinions, but shake entire narratives. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. History isn't just written by the winners. It's refined by them. Polished, reframed, packaged into something easier to swallow, and over time, the sharp edges disappear until what remains feels like absolute truth. But it isn't. Some stories don't vanish because they're false. They vanish because they're inconvenient. Because if people started connecting the dots really, connecting them would change how they see alliances, conflicts, and even the people they were taught to trust. So, let me ask you something. Why do certain events get repeated over and over in the media, while others equally important barely get mentioned at all? Why do some actions get labeled as defense, while others are instantly called aggression, even when the lines aren't so clear? And more importantly, who benefits from that framing? Because once you start looking closer, patterns begin to emerge. Not random chaos, but calculated moves, strategic silence, selective outrage, and narratives that seem to shift depending on who's telling the story. This isn't about taking sides blindly. It's about seeing beyond the surface, about recognizing that sometimes what's presented as unity hides deep fractures, and what's called conflict may only be one chapter of a much bigger story. You're not just watching events unfold, you're watching how they're presented to you. And that difference, that's where everything changes. So, before you form your next opinion, before you repeat what everyone knows, take a step back and ask yourself, are you seeing the full picture or just the version you were meant to see? Because once you realize the gap between those two, there's no going back. What you're about to see didn't begin yesterday, and it won't end tomorrow. Long before headlines started flashing across your screen, before hashtags began shaping opinions in real time, the groundwork had already been laid quietly, strategically, and often out of sight. Conflicts, alliances, rivalries, they don't just appear out of nowhere. They are built over years, sometimes decades, through decisions that rarely make it into the spotlight. And that's where the real story begins. Because what we often call breaking news is usually just the surface of something much deeper. A single moment pulled out of a long chain of events. A reaction without the full picture of what triggered it. And when you only see fragments, it becomes easy to misunderstand the whole. Think about it. How often do you actually see the full timeline of a conflict? Not just the latest incident, but the history behind it, the shifting alliances, the quiet agreements, the betrayals that never trend, and the motivations that are rarely explained in plain terms. Instead, what you get is a simplified version. Clean, direct, easy to consume. A story with clear sides, clear labels, and clear conclusions. But reality is rarely that neat. In reality, the lines blur. Allies can have conflicting interests. Rivals can share common goals. And sometimes, decisions that seem irrational on the surface begin to make sense once you understand the context they came from. But context takes time. And time doesn't always fit into a headline. So, narratives get compressed. Details get filtered. And overtime repetition turns partial stories into common knowledge. Not necessarily because they are entirely wrong, but because they are incomplete. And when something is incomplete, it can be shaped. This is where perception starts to shift, not through outright lies, but through emphasis. Through what's highlighted and what's left in the background. Through which voices are amplified and which ones fade into silence. None of this happens by accident. Information moves through layers, editors, platforms, institutions. Interests all influencing how a story is presented before it ever reaches you. And by the time it does, it already carries a certain perspective, whether you realize it or not. That doesn't mean everything you see is false, but it does mean one thing is always true. You are never just seeing events. You are seeing a version of them. So, Before we go any further, this isn't about telling you what to think. It's about giving you the missing pieces, the background, the build-up, the context that often gets overlooked. Because once you start seeing the bigger picture, the headlines stop feeling random and start feeling intentional. And that's exactly where this story begins. Now, we arrive at the part most people think they already understand: the conflict itself. On the surface, it looks straightforward. One side reacts, the other responds. Statements are made, actions follow, and within hours, the world is told who's right, who's wrong, and what it all supposedly means. It feels immediate, clear, almost scripted. But the deeper you look, the less simple it becomes. Because this isn't just a clash of actions, it's a clash of interests, ideologies, influence, and perception. And each side isn't just fighting on the ground. They're fighting to control the narrative surrounding it. Every move sends two messages at once, one to their opponent and another to the world watching. And that's where the real tension builds. What may look like a defensive action to one audience can be framed as aggression to another. What is called stability in one statement can be seen as control in another. The same event, two completely different interpretations. So the question isn't just what is happening, it's who gets to define what it means. Because in modern conflicts, perception is power. If you can shape how people understand an event, you can influence reactions without ever changing the event itself. You can gain support, justify decisions, and shift global opinion all without firing a single shot beyond the initial act. And this is where things start to escalate, not just through actions, but through responses to how those actions are perceived. A statement triggers backlash. Backlash triggers pressure. Pressure forces decisions, and those decisions create new consequences that feed right back into the cycle. It becomes a loop. Action, reaction, interpretation, amplification, over and over again. And somewhere in that cycle, the original issue, the root cause, begins to fade, replaced by newer incidents, stronger emotions, and louder voices. What started as a specific problem evolves into something much bigger, much harder to untangle. At this point, it's no longer just about resolving a conflict. It's about maintaining position, protecting influence, and avoiding the appearance of weakness. Because in a world that's constantly watching, perception isn't just important, it's strategic. And strategy doesn't always aim for resolution. Sometimes it aims for control. Control over the pace of escalation. Control over the narrative. Control over what the world pays attention to and what it ignores. So what you're witnessing isn't just a conflict unfolding in real time. It's a complex struggle between reality and perception where facts, interpretations, and interests collide, overlap, and sometimes contradict each other entirely. And until you separate those layers, it's almost impossible to see the conflict for what it truly is. So what actually matters here isn't just choosing a side, it's understanding the structure behind everything you're seeing. Because once you strip away the noise, the headlines, the tonal reactions, the simplified narratives, you start to notice something deeper. Patterns. Conflicts may look different on the surface, different places, different actors, different times. But underneath, they often follow a similar blueprint. Interests collide. Power is tested. Narratives are shaped. And public perception becomes part of the battlefield. This is the layer most people miss. Instead of asking, who's right? A more useful question is, what is driving each side? What do they gain from acting now? What do they risk by staying silent? And how do they want the world to interpret their actions? Because actions alone don't tell the full story. Timing, intention, and messaging complete the picture. What looks sudden is rarely spontaneous. Most decisions are built over time through pressure, strategy, and calculation until they reach a tipping point. And once that point is reached, every move becomes layered. A statement isn't just a statement. It can reassure allies, warn opponents, and influence public opinion at the same time. En acción hay sentidos executions, also communication. This is where understanding begins to replace assumption, because when you start seeing these layers, you stop reacting only to what's visible and start thinking about what's happening beneath it. You begin to realize that information is not always neutral in how it's delivered, not necessarily false but framed. Certain details are highlighted while others fade into the background, and over time, that framing shapes perception. This doesn't mean you should distrust everything. It means you should question how things are presented. Compare perspectives. Notice what stays consistent and what changes depending on who is speaking. Those differences often reveal more than the message itself. And here's the key insight. Clarity doesn't come from more information. It comes from understanding how that information is constructed. Because in a world where people see the same event but reach different conclusions, the advantage belongs to those who can see beyond the surface. Once you reach that point, something shifts. You stop reacting impulsively. You start recognizing patterns. And instead of being carried by the narrative, you begin to analyze it. And that shift from passive viewer to active observer is where real understanding begins. And this is where everything changes. Because at some point, you have to confront a possibility that most people avoid, not because it's complicated, but because it is uncomfortable. What if the conflict you're watching isn't just about what's happening, but about how it's being understood? What if the real battle isn't only fought on the ground but inside the minds of the people observing it? Because once perception becomes a battlefield, truth is no longer just discovered. It's competed over, and in that competition, the strongest force isn't always facts, it's framing, the angle, the timing, the repetition. Say something often enough, present it convincingly enough, and over time it stops being questioned. Not because it's fully true, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It builds trust without verification. It creates certainty without full understanding. It turns partial views into firm beliefs. So when you see people arguing endlessly, defending positions, rejecting others, convinced they're standing on absolute truth, what you're often seeing isn't just disagreement. You're seeing the result of different narratives, shaped by different framings, reaching different conclusions from the same reality. And that's the turning point. Because the moment you realize that, you stop asking, which side is louder? You stop asking, which version is more popular? Instead, you start asking the only question that actually matters. Who benefits from me believing this version of the story? Because belief is influence. And influence, at scale, is power. The power to justify actions. The power to silence criticism. The power to rally support or manufacture consent. And once that power is in play, the conflict expands far beyond its original form. It's no longer just about territory, decisions, or events. It becomes about control over meaning itself. Control over how reality is interpreted, remembered, and passed on. And here's the part most people never realize. You don't need to control what happens. If you can control how people understand what happens, that's the real leverage. That's the hidden layer behind the visible conflict. So, the next time you see a headline, a viral clip, a clear narrative that seems too certain, too complete, too perfectly aligned, pause. Not to reject it, but to examine it. Because the most powerful narratives aren't the ones that look false. They're the ones that feel true without ever being fully questioned. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. From that point on, you're no longer just consuming information. You're decoding it. And that changes everything. So now, the question isn't just what you've watched, it's what you're going to do with it. Because understanding something at this level comes with a choice. You can go back to scrolling, reacting, and accepting information the way it's usually presented, quick, simplified, and unquestioned. Or you can start seeing things differently. You can slow down, look deeper, ask better questions. Not just what is happening, but why is it being shown this way? Not just who is speaking, but who benefits from this message being believed. Because once you begin to question the structure behind the story, you stop being easily influenced by it. And that shift matters. It means you're no longer just part of the audience. You become aware of the stage itself. So, here's what I want you to do next. Don't just agree with this video. Don't just disagree with it either. Test it. The next time you see a headline that feels obvious, pause. The next time a clip goes viral and everyone seems to have the same opinion, take a step back. The next time something triggers a strong reaction, ask yourself where that reaction is coming from, because awareness starts in those small moments. And over time, those moments build a different way of thinking, one that isn't easily shaped, rushed, or redirected. If this perspective made you think even for a second, then don't let it stop here. Take it further. Watch more critically. Compare more sources. Pay attention not just to information, but to how it's delivered. And if you believe more people need to see things this way, then share this. Not to prove a point, not to win an argument, but to open a door. Because the more people begin to question narratives instead of just consuming them, the harder it becomes for any single version of reality to dominate without scrutiny. And that's where real awareness begins to spread. So, if you're ready to stop just watching the story and start understanding it, make that choice now. Follow, subscribe, and stay with this channel, because this isn't about giving you answers. It's about helping you see what was always there, but rarely noticed. And once you see it, you don't go back. And in the end, this was never just about a single conflict, a single headline, or a single version of events. It was about something much bigger: how reality is presented, how meaning is shaped, and how easily perception can be guided without most people ever noticing. Because the world you see is not only defined by what happens, but by how it's shown to you. Every image, every statement, every breaking update carries a layer of intent, and sometimes obvious, sometimes subtle, but always present. And over time, those layers build something powerful, a version of reality that feels complete, even when it isn't. That's the illusion. Not that everything is false, but that what is true is often incomplete. And once you accept incomplete information as the full picture, you stop searching. You stop questioning. You start reacting instead of understanding. But now, you've seen the gap, the space between what happens and how it's interpreted. And that awareness changes how you move forward. Because from this point on, every headline becomes a question. Every narrative becomes something to examine. Every obvious truth becomes something worth looking at twice. Not out of doubt for the sake of doubt, but out of clarity. Because real clarity isn't loud. It isn't rushed. It doesn't demand immediate reaction. It builds quietly through observation, comparison, and the willingness to look beyond the surface. And the more you practice that, the more patterns begin to reveal themselves. What once felt random starts to feel structured. What once felt confusing starts to make sense. What once felt convincing starts to be questionable. Not weaker, but clearer. And that's the difference. You're no longer just receiving information. You're interpreting it. You're filtering it. You're understanding the forces behind it. And in a world where attention is constantly pulled, shaped, and redirected, that ability is rare. Because most people don't realize they're being influenced. But you do. And that awareness, by itself, is a form of independence. So as this video ends, don't think of it as a conclusion. Think of it as a shift. A different way of seeing what was always in front of you. Because the story doesn't stop here. The headlines will keep coming. The narratives will keep evolving. The noise will keep getting louder. But now, you're not just hearing it. You're listening differently. And once that changes, everything else follows.